Anna Ford once again on the trail of the perfect image in a film garlanded at the 1987 Film and Television Festival of New York. The search for realism.
The magazine Business Week called it the Thousand Island problem. It's quite a sticky question for product designers at a major food company. What is the optimal shape for the salad dressing bottle of tomorrow? How slender can the neck be and yet still dispense the condiment at a constant rate? How should the lettering appear on the label? What will the bottle look like on a store shelf next to its rival? Package designers used to answer these questions by experimenting with dozens of physical models and different renderings. But now they're getting a hand from a new generation of special graphics computers. This method of simulating a new product promises such a competitive edge that the food company, now puzzling out the Thousand Island problem, won't let its name be used. So, to find out about these new systems, we first went to the movie industry on a trek to discover some of the important issues in the pursuit of realism by computer graphics. We wanted to see what the potential was for computer-aided design.
Well, CAD/CAM is in an early stage, in my opinion. In fact, all computer graphics, this is the early days of computer graphics. We're still turning the crank on the Model T. We hope to change that, by the way. The reason we see gears and camshafts and things like that right now are because you can only render in real time a small number of polygons. And as soon as possible, which Pixar hopes to help happen in the next, say, 5 years nominally, is to increase the number of polygons that people can deal with rapidly and complexly, you know, with textures and lighting and shadows and anti-aliasing and all those nice things that are the tools of the trade of computer synthesis and visualization.
But only the extinct species, humpback whale, can give the proper response to the probe. Do you concur with this opinion?
So what stage are we at in computer graphics development? Up to now, feature films have been one of the few uses that have shown the potential of the new systems.
We are computing our trajectory at this time.
Get him back! Get him back!
At Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, part of Lucasfilms, they were given a problem by the director of the new Paramount production, Star Trek IV. Captain Kirk and crew of the Enterprise have decided to travel back in time using a slingshot effect around the sun.
Well, for this shot, the storyboards that we had called for the dream sequence that the character is having to begin with images of his crew members rising out of a sea of fog, and with each face sort of metamorphosing from one crew member's head to another. And so the first part of our problem was a data entry problem. We have a couple of different ways of doing that. We could start by showing the 3D digitizer.
Oh, sure. This is our 3D digitizer. It's basically a table that has a device in it to generate a magnetic field. And we have this wand, which is really an antenna, and it senses the magnetic field. And with that, the computer can read the XYZ position and also the axes of rotation, 3 axes of rotation. What I'm going to show you is how I would digitize a hand. Actually, the whole process takes a long time, so I'll just show you a little piece. We're going to make a patch on the surface, over the surface of my finger here. And to do that, we're going to draw some control lines. Now, along these control lines is where the vertices of the patch are going to be. The patch is not actually going to go through these lines, but it'll be controlled by points along these lines. And I have to put in all the lines in one direction. We'll call it, say, the Y direction. And then I go back. I can use my pocket terminal to change directions and put in control lines in the other direction. And if you look at the image, you can almost see that it's really drawing lines in 3D. Once I put in the control lines, I can hit a button and the computer is calculating the patch surface. You can see it there. We'll fly around a little bit and take a better look at that. And you see that's just one small patch. To really do a finger, we'd have to do a patch on the bottom, and we'd have to do a patch on the end to close the finger, and so on to cover the whole hand.
So the control lines and their intersection points are used to define what's called a surface patch. Several of these patches are needed to describe the complete finger. This surface description is then displayed by a series of contour lines.
We've got a more complete hand, which we digitized some time ago. I'll fly around and look at this. This is made of a lot of patches. Each finger has about 2 patches, and the top and the bottom of the hand are digitized separately. One thing that's nice about the digitizer is you can fly right through your model. That's fun. Like that. With this program, we can also just freeze the view, and you'll notice that little box, and that represents a control point on the surface of the patch. And as I move the wand, I can move the surface around. That's a very good feature. We can also distort the surface just a little by moving the vectors tangent to the parametric directions on the patch. And as you can see, it just sort of floats around and distorts as I move that vector. Now you can see that's going to be a very tedious thing to do an entire head that way, because you have to break it up into so many small patches. So for Star Trek, what we did is we went down to this company that's in Monterey, and they have a system that uses a video camera and 2 light sources. And the 2 light sources shine on the head of the subject being digitized. This is Leonard Nimoy. And they create a profile of light on his head, and the camera can see that and digitize that profile. Now, Leonard Nimoy's on a little rotating turntable there, so as he turns around, you get a profile of every point on his head. Once we had the data points from the company down in Monterey, we had to convert them into a form that our computer system would understand, and then link the data points into patches. This is a small section of the data, and you can see it's linked with patches. We use this program to see different views. Now, once we had the models, we could start to think about doing the interpolation, and the first thing we had to do was align the different heads together. I can turn Spock off and put Bones on, and that's what he looks like. Now, if I put them both on together, uh-oh, I lost my pen, okay. If I put them both on together, you can get an idea of whether their noses align and their eyes align, and it's important to have the patches consistent for interpolation.
The finished sequence also required this image of a whale. This was hand-traced from a clay model using the 3D digitizer. Having created the whale and metamorphosed the heads, the action was choreographed by a keyframe animation program. The final process was to pick surface texture and specify lighting. Let's see what the computer did.
I should never have left.
Control, sir. The mains are down, sir. Box power is... I can't jump around. What is the thing to do?
Mission. Spock, you're talking about the end of every life on Earth.
Lucasfilm's computer graphics division used to include a research and development group. These individuals formed a separate company in 1986 called Pixar. Among other things, they recently turned their attention to the problems of computer modeling angle poise lamps. Bill Reeves is Director of Animation Research.
Well, that was John's idea, John Lasseter, the animator on the piece. And he's been in love with lamps as a character to work with for many years. As a student at Cal Arts, he did a film with lamps. And they're a very interesting thing. They don't have a face or anything like that, so you have to portray personality. You know, it is a character. We want it to be character, and in a different way. And we do that by motion, by action, by, you know, the way they interact with each other and things like that. And so he started modeling this lamp. You know, we had these Luxo lamps sitting on our desks, and so he saw that, oh, yeah, this is interesting. It's got interesting armatures, interesting movement, and he started modeling it without even thinking about making a film about it, actually. It was just an experiment to play with. For example, consider modeling a lamp like this. You have different types of geometry. You have surfaces that are very flat, rectangular, like the brackets here, and you have something very smooth and shaped, like the base or the part of the lamp here. You have things that are very rigid, you know, made out of metal, but you have things that are very springy. You have the cord, which is very matte, flat. You have the light itself, casting light. You have reflections that are up on here, and you have highlights, you know, specular highlights that are coming from various other types of light sources. You have all the angles and the sort of the hinges that make the lamp move as well. And then you have the shadows themselves. You know, you have self shadowing here, where the lamp is casting shadows on itself. These brackets make very complex shadows. And then, of course, the shadow the lamp is casting shadow onto the table here as well, so that you get, you know, very interesting shadow effects down underneath and all over the place. So it's, even for something very simple like a lamp, it's very complex.
Realism is a worthy goal, but I hope people understand computer graphics is not restricted to realism. I prefer to say that what we're really after is the pursuit of the complexity of reality. I mean, why be constrained to reality? I think you can tell that, you know, by some of the things we do, like simulation of the lamps, for example. Sure, we simulate the lamp as realistically as possible, but then you can take the lamp to unreal extremes.
The man whose company is responsible for Luxo Jr., Luxo, by the way, is the American name for those lamps, is Alvy Ray Smith, Vice President and co-founder of Pixar. After 15 years in computer graphics, he's regarded as one of the world's senior researchers. Driving into work from his home just north of San Francisco, we asked Alvy why his company produced Luxo Jr.
Well, the main reason for making Luxo is because John Lasseter and Bill Reeves and Evan Osby wanted to make it. We'd like to let our especially talented people do what they want to because it pays off. And second reason, of course, was to show off the latest techniques that we've mastered. In particular, the one most important new technique in Luxo is self-shadowing, very complex objects casting shadows on themselves without the expense of so-called ray tracing.
Ray tracing is a key mathematical technique in achieving realism. It's very good for modelling shiny and other surfaces. But just how does it work?
Ray tracing is really nothing more than just simulation of each ray of light as it comes from a light source and passes through refractions and reflections of objects in the scene until it reaches the eye. And if you think about how a light ray, when it hits a mirror, it's got to divide in. When it hits a piece of glass, part of it will reflect off the glass and part of it will go through the glass. So now you have two rays to follow, and they may break up into two, and it becomes recursively explosive, hence expensive computationally. Our technique does the same thing essentially at a much cheaper price. If we're ever going to hope to film, to simulate scenes such as the one we're driving through here, then we need to have trees, of course. Complex phenomena, but you can tell, you just think about it for a moment, there's no way anybody's ever going to sit down and actually model any one tree, much less a forested tree or a whole woods. Each tree has thousands and thousands of leaves. Somebody would have to place each leaf independently. There's no way, it's just too much, it's just too intensive. What we look for are techniques, which I call database amplification techniques, which, with a little human effort, get amplified into gigantic databases of a complexity which we humans find pleasing.
The person responsible for that animation was Bill Reeves. Like Alvy, he's a world leader in his field. Bill was also technical director of Luxo Jr, so we asked him how he models trees and other natural features compared with man-made objects like lamps.
Yeah, well, natural phenomena, in my mind, is very complex. You know, it's a complexity that's much more than man-made things. In man-made things, you have a certain number of surfaces, and to make pictures of them, you sort of deal with the surface characteristics, shading, texturing, lighting, that type of thing. But in realistic images, natural phenomena, here are some examples from Andre and Wally that I did a couple years ago. You have, at least I build up complexity by the number of primitives, the number of particles. These are done with particle systems. And it's sort of like, you know, pointillism in a way, like Seurat or Van Gogh used to do many years ago. We're using sort of some of their tricks, is that, you know, each of these trees has maybe 50,000, 100,000 little particles in them, little primitives that have really no direct shape. They're just a little dot of color. Each of the colors are different. And so you build up complexity by having many, many, many different primitives that together form a shape, a tree in this example, but independently there's just a little dot of color. But I have some other examples from, let's see if I got them here, of another thing that we were doing last year, and this is where we did a model of ocean waves. And this is done with bicubic meshes of patches, the surface of the ocean. What we had to do that is we had to understand what the physics are of ocean waves.
To model the geometry of this scene, Bill and a colleague had to search the literature and find a mathematical description of how waves form. In a paper dated 1870, they found a theory that wave particles moved in circles. Join these particles together and you get a surface. Add features like a beach whose undersea topography causes the moving waves to crash, and you have a dynamic model. This in turn could provide the data for a rendering system which adds texture, reflection and refractions. This is the complex realism of natural scenes. But can these techniques be applied to designing man-made products?
Now this is a system for modeling man-made type objects, and it's on a vector display so that we can see it as a wire frame, but see it rotate and move in real time. First of all, we have all sorts of controls for controlling the camera, looking at different views of the object, if you will. We can zoom in and out of the object, or we can spin around and look at it from various points of view, so we can get a feel for what our geometry looks like. We can also change the geometry of our objects. You can see that it's made out of very simple shapes, as opposed to some of the particle systems, some of the natural phenomena stuff. Here we have, like, the wheel is a torus. The spokes are just very, very thin cylinders. The forks are made out of cylinders and tori pieces, and the seat is made out of a mesh of bicubic patches, but still pretty simple.
These bicubic surface patches are similar constructions to those we saw earlier at ILM. All points on the surface patch can be described mathematically by means of two cubic functions, hence the term bicubic surface patch. So this vector display system can adjust the geometry and set the animation before moving to a raster system for rendering.
We'll go over we'll look at this on the raster system then, the various build up the various surface characteristics.
On this raster scan system, we can look at the successive build-up of rendering effects. First, the unicycle is lit by a single point light source. This gives a dull, grey, matte look to the surfaces. Now a second light is added. Both of these lights are close to the model. A third, distant ambient light, shining up from the bottom, gives an effect on the springs and the bottom bolt. Next, in the move towards reality, a specular component is added to all the surfaces. This gives the bike a gleam in various places. Now the rendering process turns to the materials that make up the unicycle, adding different surface descriptions. These produce different reflectivities. But of course, this is still all black and white. What about colours? And then texture. The unicycle gets a synthetic leopard skin seat. And finally, well, it's possible to see the world around us reflected in the shiny things we look at.
The final one here is that we have added an environment map where we reflect an environment to the pieces, to the shiny pieces. Think of it as a big, big sphere that surrounds the scene that you're making a picture of, and on that sphere is painted a picture, if you will. And then what you do is you use that as the reflection. Essentially, it's angle of incidence equals angle of reflection based on the normal of the surface and based on where the camera is that's viewing the scene. And you sort of fire a ray in and it bounces off in a certain direction and it hits that sphere at a certain point. So there's a certain color at that point in the sphere. And you use that color as the reflection component for the surface. But you also have a specular component that you add in, and maybe a diffuse component that you add in, maybe an ambient component that you add in. You keep adding these various things, all to calculate the color of one particular pixel. So you see, we take simple thing, we keep adding more and more to the surface descriptions until we get a final picture that's pretty interesting. The first ones were awful dull, weren't they?
Of course, an actual problem requires all these modelling, lighting and rendering techniques and more, as each new concept invariably requires a new piece of software. One of the most comprehensive problems faced by the team was for an earlier Star Trek movie. For that, the storyline called for a computer to give a demonstration of how a new living planet could be created from a dead one.
Device into a pre-selected area of a lifeless space body, a moon or other dead form. The device is delivered, instantaneously causing what we call the Genesis effect. Matter is reorganized with life-generating results.
Lauren Carpenter worked on that project for Pixar, at that time part of Lucasfilms. We asked Lauren what were some of the problems he had to solve when modelling a planet.
Planets are big. They have lots of detail, and they have a lot of dynamic range and scale. So from a faraway perspective, they're a little sphere, and from a close perspective, they're a full landscape with things on it. And in some situations, you only need one scale, like far away or up close. But in the Genesis sequence that we worked on, we needed all scales. We had to be down on the surface, traveling very fast, and we had to be far away, looking at it as a sphere. You have to think about the transition between these two scales, or these many scales too, because sometimes programs work well at one scale and not at another. And we spent as much time worrying about the transitions as we did about the programs that worked at the individual scales. So they had to be smooth and seamless.
As well as these general problems, the task also called for a number of detailed techniques. So we asked Lauren to take us through these in sequence.
Okay, the first view that one sees of the planet is a cratered moon. And that was done by Tom Duff, who's now at Bell Laboratories. And he constructed a map of where the craters were by randomly dropping mud into a rectangle and seeing how it splashed. Basically, that's essentially what he did on the computer. And given this description of where the craters were, somewhat distorted because of the fact that it was a sphere, then he wrapped this onto a sphere and made perspective views of the sphere from different directions. And so we had a cratered sphere. And it was done very carefully to allow for the shading and so forth, as the way the light bounces off of a lumpy surface. That worked fine up until about 5,000 miles or so. And then what happened was that the texture map got to be very big, and so the samples of altitudes got to be far apart, and so you could start seeing the graininess of it. And so down closer, then we went to fractals, and where you can see the relief in valleys and lakes and so on. And then farther away again, we went to a painting, which had color in it and clouds and oceans and so forth.
What about the fire?
The fire, yes. I can't forget the fire. The fire was a technique that was added on top of the bumps or the craters. It's done in a compositing method, by a compositing method where we compute the fire element and mat it over the cratered planet. And this matting technique, which we've developed to a high degree around here, we use in all of our productions and so forth. But so it allows one program to worry about one kind of thing and another program to worry about another kind of thing, and you put them together with a very simple compositing method. The fire was done by Bill Reeves, and it was really intended as, from my perspective anyway, as modeling volcanoes, where hot projectiles are flung out on a parabolic arc influenced by gravity, and they cool as they travel. And so they change color and direction. And these were all happening in their own reference frame as the camera was moving by. And so all this geometry of 3 dimensions and motion and stuff gives it a very real sense. One of the tricks or the problems with fire was making it dense enough, because every one of these little particles only covered a small piece of the screen. And so if you wanted to have a wall of fire or a region of fire, it took hundreds of thousands of these things. Today, with the graphic standards that we have, we make much higher resolution pictures than we did back then. And in fact, the pictures that we made back then appear small to us today. with big fuzzy pixels. It's a funny perspective. But even then it took hundreds of thousands. Today it would take millions.
Capable of sustaining whatever life forms we see fit to deposit on it.
Fascinating.
With images like this, it may come as a surprise to find out that there are still many areas to be developed in the quest for realism. For instance, environmental effects like skylight or fog. For these, we had to travel here to Japan, to Hiroshima University, where Professor Nakamai has specialized in lighting and atmospheric effects. Like Luxo Jr., Andre and Wally B in The Clown's Unicycle, this room only exists in the mind of the computer. It's illuminated by a point of artificial light. Look at the shadows and the fall-off of illumination with distance from the bulb. This information can also be used for analysis. These are isolux maps, color belts of similar light levels. And this symbol shows the distribution of light intensity from the bulb in different directions. Useful for interior lighting design.
I developed some techniques overlapping the perspective view and isolux color belts. Color belt give us the information of the how much lux there, and another part give us some atmosphere in the interior. That is why we developed that one.
But it's also useful to model exterior lighting. Professor Nakamai's team have developed a program to model the different components of skylight. These are sky dome maps, like the environment maps that Bill Reeves put on the unicycle. Only here, we're looking up at an imaginary hemisphere representing the brightness of the sky. The top left shows a cloudy day, and in the others, the red part marks the position of the sun. So this exterior scene is shown with direct sunlight and evenly spread ambient light. The tones in the shadows are the same, and so it's difficult to see detail. Here the view again shows direct sunlight, but this time their skylight is added. In real life, of course, it's this mixture of lighting that allows us to see detail, because detail is modelled, in the sculptural sense, by light and shade. And here the sky is overcast. It's features like these that add to realism. Other lighting models can calculate mixed interior lighting, in this case with two area light sources. In this view, there's also indirect illumination produced by interreflection. But Professor Nakamai's latest work is on a murkier subject. Imagine how this would look in fog and at night.
Ray tracing takes tremendous time. So we recently developed a local ray tracing method that is combined with the scanline algorithm method. And just it works for the just materials which had the characteristic of specular mirror or refraction. So we can save the time. But unfortunately now our program just works for parallel light source and point light source only. So we have to extend to the linear light source, area light source, and so on. Last SIGGRAPH, someone told me, will you bring the next summer the rain scene? It's very difficult, so I can do that. But one of my dreams is a kind of drive simulator, like flight simulator.
So atmospheric effects of fog, rain and snow will soon be added to the list of programs that will be able to be run on simulation computers. And of course, designers too will be able to use these effects to demonstrate to their clients how their buildings or product might look when completed. But it's the speed at which these images can be delivered which will ultimately determine the use of sophisticated computer graphics in CAD. This is Kawasaki railway station, just outside Tokyo. It was here that we journeyed to find out if these sorts of images could be produced more quickly by developing special hardware as well as software. Hiroyuki Sato is working with his research colleagues to try and incorporate more powerful computer graphics into CAD systems. He works for Fujitsu, one of the largest computer manufacturers in Japan. We asked him first what Fujitsu was doing in this area.
Well, we are developing a parallel processor. It's called cellular array processor, CAP, and it is general purpose but somewhat oriented to image generations, and we are implementing a ray tracing. Ray tracing takes much time, so we are trying to speed up ray tracing using CAP systems.
Traditionally, there's been one microprocessor that calculates the components of the image. This works down the screen line by line. This takes time, especially when you've a complicated set of algorithms, as you do for ray tracing. So Fujitsu's CAP system has more than one processor. It's called parallel processing. Each processor can be thought of as a cell, which generates a sub-image covering part of the screen. So the speed of performance increases linearly with the number of processors. At the moment, the system has 64, but Fujitsu has plans to increase this to 256. They also have ongoing software research. These computer programs aim to make it easier for a designer who may not be a computer specialist to create and alter the model. This bar has been rendered using another set of programs, but the image retains jagged diagonals. They know that it is possible to smooth them, but at the moment it takes too much time. Again, the changes are easy to specify. Using the CAP system, each of these changes only took a matter of seconds. Conventionally, each of them would probably take a couple of hours to generate. This enables a designer to modify the image interactively. The same programs can of course be used to model these chess pieces. Yet other programs can produce geometry moves like this. Fujitsu have plans to demonstrate the power of the system by linking it to a chess game.
We have now 3 generations of CAP systems. The first system was developed in 1983, and the second version we are currently using has more memory in each process, and the third version will have 256 processors. it's much faster than our current versions. And we implement our interactive softwares and integrate them. And we need much more computing power. Our current versions use 16-bit processors, and we are going to use more powerful processor, such as 32-bit processor, or other anything. We are not sure now.
Fujitsu obviously have some ideas up their sleeves, as you'd expect from a major computer company. But Pixar in America have also built a fast commercial graphics machine. Why did they get involved in hardware?
The basic theory of computer science is that anything that can be implemented in software can be implemented in hardware. That's the basic. The historical and practical way to go is to do the algorithm, the software development first, try out the idea before you dare freeze it into hardware. But you know that you can always freeze it into hardware if you really think you have to take you need that additional speed that implementing in hardware gives you. And by additional speed, I mean, you know, an order or two of magnitude in speed. It's serious improvement in speed.
The Pixar image computer is very fast. Speed of processing is achieved by assigning 4 parallel processors to each pixel. There's the red, green and blue primaries, but also an alpha component, which can carry extra information, for example, for anti-aliasing, overlays or matting, the film process of adding a background to a special effects shot.
When we finished the Genesis sequence in 1981, 82, we'd computed it on general-purpose machines, DEC Baxes and the sort of general-purpose machines that you find around graphics labs these days. And it was taking a while for each frame, you know, like 40 minutes to an hour sometimes. And that's okay for video resolution production, but we were in the movie business. We wanted films that had richness of detail that was as good as live action. And so this means millions of pixels, not just hundreds of thousands. And it means compute times of 10 and 20 times greater because we wanted a more model complexity as well as greater resolution.
Happy birthday, Pixar, and happy first anniversary. You can come out and get a piece of cake and we'll bring the drinks around. Also, would you sort of mix it up and introduce yourselves to the new people?
Ed Catmull, Pixar's joint vice president, opening a party to celebrate the company's first year of independent operations selling the computer. They also found out today they had something else to celebrate. Luxo Jr. has been nominated in the 1987 Academy Awards. The owner of the company is Apple founder Steve Jobs. How did he feel about the nomination?
I think it's only the second time that a computer animated film has ever been nominated, and the first one was sort of not a completely computer animated one. The computer, I just did the in-betweening.
Yeah, the computer did the in-between.
So this is the first time a truly computer animated film's been nominated. I think that's great, and I think it portends much more of this stuff in the future.
The future, I mean, why we want to implement things in hardware and computer graphics is because the basic algorithms are very, very complex. And in order to get any work done in our lifetime, we have to get a speed up now and not wait for general purpose machines to finally catch up to us. I think they'll catch up to us, by the way, in about 2000 or 2010, cost effectively. So we've got to drop it into hardware now.
Rob Cook and I, who's one of the senior scientists around here, invented a process for doing this sort of thing. And it's somewhat radical. We've written it up for SIGGRAPH this year, finally, after 4 years of thinking about it. But we're currently putting it in hardware. And it should enable us to make pictures on the order of 100 to 1,000 times faster than a VAX. Which means for the first time that the cost of the machinery is no problem, is not the driving force in making an animated film. The rendering part now becomes cheap. And what becomes expensive is the people time, the animators, the model building, and so I'm going to turn my attention to that in the future.
Animation at a high level of perfection is not economically feasible anymore. Like in the heydays of Disney, where there were thousands of artists that you could hire very cheaply, that was wonderful. Maybe not for the artists, but for Disney. And now it's the only way to do it is going to be with a computer. So it'd be nice to get rid of all that trashy animation and get back to some, you know, Fantasia quality stuff.
What our business is visualization, and animation of complex processes falls out of that. And there are several steps in animation. One is you have to model what you're going to move. You have to animate it, which is adding the time to the model. And then you have to render the result. Now, the rendering of the result, which is the part that has taken everybody's best brains for the last 15 years. But it's the least human part. I mean, it's physics. You say, here are the light sources, here are the colors, here's the textures we want on the surface, and the kind of glossy finish or matte finish we want. Go render it, machine. You want that just to happen, just instantaneous if possible, so that the real work of doing a piece of art or a piece of scientific education is the design of the piece and the creation of the storyline and the look and the the human part. So that's where we're headed.